And now, marine weather around Alaska. I'm meteorologist Peter Chan with the National Weather Service, and now here is your Alaska marine weather as we go into this weekend. First, we start out with the sea ice. And early ice formation is occurring along areas of the Arctic coast, as well as in through Kotzebue Sound around Selawik Lake, and also in through areas of Norton Sound, especially there at the Koyuk Inlet. So early ice formation, always want to be very careful. We also see a little ice beginning to form along the YK Delta and across areas of eastern Russia. And just a reminder of ice safety, especially with lakes, inland lakes. These are some minimum thickness guidelines. This is for new clear ice only. You want a minimum of 4 inches of ice to support ice fishing and walking around on. If it's 2 inches or less, stay off. 5 inches will support small groups of people ice skating. You need 6 or more of good solid ice for a snow machine. And then when we're starting to talk about vehicles, 9 or more for a car and pickup truck, especially with any added weight, well over a foot of ice. And we're not yet there early in the season, but I do want to emphasize that this ice thickness can certainly vary and be much thinner on lakes where you have springs feeding the lake, also if there are any inlets or outlets. So please be very careful here in the early season, and especially ice on rivers. That's a whole nother game, because when you have flowing water, that has a tendency to create areas where the ice may be thinner. So be especially careful here. But looking at the weather map, we have a broad ridge of high pressure at the surface and aloft over northwest Canada, poking into the eastern mainland. Low pressure out in the central Bering, not especially strong, but it does have a frontal system associated with it. A flow of relatively milder air coming in up out of the North Pacific along through the eastern half of the Bering. So along areas of the west coast this weekend, there is the potential for some mixed precipitation, some light rain, light snow that could be mixed at times with a little bit of freezing rain, freezing drizzle, or even some sleet. And as we go into Saturday afternoon, low pressure sits out here over the Bering with a secondary low trying to pull up to just south of Kodiak Island and off of the Alaska Peninsula. We have the ridge of high pressure still holding over northwest Canada, but it's begun to at least de-amplify and shift a little further south and east by Sunday. That high remains over western Canada up into central Canada. And that's allowed this front and some of that moisture to push a little further inland into the western interior. So again, these areas here along the west coast, YK Deltas on up Seward Peninsula, northwest coast, could see a light mix of some precipitation. And further inland, it could be in the form of some light snow that may be mixed with a little rain or some freezing rain. But otherwise, this low is not especially strong and weakening. And we have low pressure system trying to push up into the southwestern Gulf that could bring some showers, areas of rain to parts of the Seward Peninsula, and eventually up into the northern, northeastern Gulf Coast later in the weekend and early next week. But looking at our wind and wave forecast for Saturday for the inner channels, variable winds around 5 knots, Stevens Passage, Lynn Canal waves a foot or 2, northwest winds 10 knots, 2-foot waves, Ketchikan, Metla, Katla. Outer coast, north-northwest winds 10 to 15 knots, waves generally 4 to 5 feet tops. On Sunday, inner channels will see north-northwest winds around 10 knots, waves a foot or 2. Outer coast, east winds turning more southeasterly, 15 to 20 knots, as high as 25 knots there. Near Cape Suckling with waves 5 to 6 feet, but higher, 8 to 11 feet outside of Yakutat Bay and toward Cape Suckling. And then for the northwestern Gulf, winds will be easterly on Saturday, 10 knots within Prince William Sound, waves there a couple of feet, but look for northeast winds 15 to 20 knots down through upper and middle Cook Inlet, and easterly winds to 30 knots at the entrance of Cook Inlet into Kamishak Bay with waves as high as 6 to 8 feet. And Sunday, we expect the winds to increase with that system further south and west, tightening the pressure gradient. So easterly winds 30 knots, as high as 35 to 40 knots out of the east-northeast at the entrance of Cook Inlet with waves up 8-10 feet. Look for easterly winds 20 knots within Prince William Sound, waves 3-4 feet there, and north winds 20 to as high as 30 knots there off of Anchor Point with waves 5 to 8 feet. Kodiak Island on Saturday, we'll see easterly winds 20 to 25 knots, waves 7 to 8 feet, including Shelikof Strait. Bristol Bay, we're looking at 30-knot easterly winds, as well as there east of Chicknick, 30-knot winds, waves 5 feet. There within Bristol Bay, 9 feet off of Chicknick, and then winds more southeasterly down toward Cold Bay and Falls Pass at 15 knots, waves 3 to 5 feet. For Sunday, winds will be east-northeast, 20-25 knots, highest there through Shelikof Strait with 5-foot waves, 10 feet well off of Kodiak Island. Variable winds around 10 knots here toward Perryville, Sand Point. We're kind of in a lull there, a trough line that is lying across the Alaska Peninsula. Winds turn more east-southeast, 15 knots around Cold Bay and Falls Pass. The eastern Aleutians, relatively light winds, 10 to 15 knots, mainly turning back toward the south. As we go further west, winds will be out of the west-northwest, 25 to 30 knots. Waves building back up 9 to 11 feet once you get well west of Adak. And for Sunday, winds still have an easterly component around Dutch Harbor on Alaska, but turning back to the northwest, 15 to 20 knots west of Nikolsky, and then more westerly west of Adak. And waves generally running 5 to 6 feet on the North Pacific side and 4 to 6 feet on the Bering side, though a little higher once you get west of Adak. Along the southwest coast, Bristol Bay, Kuskokwim Bay, east-southeast winds to 30 knots, waves 6 to 7 feet. We're looking at offshore flow here within Norton Sound in the lower Yukon Delta, 20 to 25 knots with waves 4 to 5 feet once you get a little ways offshore. And for Sunday, winds come down a bit in Kuskokwim Bay and Bristol Bay, 20 to 25 knot easterly winds with waves 3 to 5 feet. Offshore flow still 20 knots with waves running around 4 feet there off the lower Yukon Delta, south side there of Norton Sound. And then St. Paul, St. George, variable winds only around 10 knots, waves 5 feet. Finally, as we get up toward the far north, winds north of St. Lawrence Island and south of the Bering Strait will generally be southeasterly 25 knots, waves 5 to 7 feet. Lower Chukchi Sea, southeast winds 20 to 25 knots, waves 4 to 5 feet, and winds generally out of the east-southeast 15 knots along the Arctic coast, waves 3 to 4 feet. And by Sunday, winds shift southwest 15 to 20 knots along the Arctic coast with waves 3 to as high as 4 feet near Utqiagvik. Those winds turn back around north-northeast there, west of Point Lay and Wainwright, but then southeasterly to 15 knots, Point Hope down to Shishmaref with waves 3 to 5 feet. In the lower Chukchi Sea, and then winds more easterly south of the Bering Strait to 20 knots with waves of 4 to 6 feet, especially there off of Wales and Port Clarence and on the north side of St. Lawrence Island.